The wind off the high desert always carried the scent of crushed sage and ancient dust. It beat against the weather-beaten siding of the ranch house, a steady rhythmic thrum that had become the soundtrack to my solitary days. The house was old, built from timber dragged down from the ridge half a century ago, and it settled into the earth with the heavy creaking sighs of an exhausted beast. For 3 years, that silence had been my only companion. It was a dense physical thing, filling the room she used to occupy, thickening the air, until it felt like walking through deep water. Her office sat at the end of the long hallway. I kept the heavy oak door shut most days. It was easier that way. But the latch had never held right, and sometimes the cross drafts would push it open, revealing the frozen museum of her life. The roll-top desk still held her ledger, the inkwell dry, the fountain pen resting exactly where she had left it. Bundles of dried lavender and yarrow hung from the exposed rafters, their color leached away by time, leaving behind a faint spectral perfume that mingled with the smell of old paper and oiled leather. Every afternoon, just before the sun dipped below the jagged line of the western horizon, a single shaft of amber light would cut through the smudged window pane. It illuminated the dust motes suspended in the dead air, making them look like a galaxy of tiny drifting stars. I would stand in the doorway, my shoulder pressed against the jamb, watching the light crawl across the floorboards until the shadows swallowed it whole. It was a ritual of quiet endurance. Then came the evening the darkness refused to yield. The sky had bruised into a deep purple, promising a bitter cold night. I had walked into her office, intending to fetch a particular book on wintering livestock she had favored. I reached for the brass toggle switch mounted on the plaster wall, a familiar motion born of muscle memory. The click was loud in the empty room. What followed was not the warm, familiar bloom of yellow light, but a sharp, crackling snap. A flash of blue arced behind the brass plate, brief and bright as a lightning strike, followed immediately by the acrid metallic tang of melted copper and burning dust. The bulb in the overhead fixture gave one weak, desperate pulse and died. The sudden darkness was absolute. It felt heavier than the twilight outside. It felt like a door slamming shut. I stood perfectly still, my hand hovering near the switch. The smell of ozone hung sharp in my nostrils, a harsh intruder in the sanctuary of dried lavender. I waited for my eyes to adjust, letting the gray light from the window carve out the familiar shapes of the desk and the armchair. A practical mind takes over when the heart is paralyzed. The circuit had blown, a wire had arched. It was a simple problem of physics and age. I retreated to the kitchen, found the heavy metal flashlight in the utility drawer, and returned to the hallway. The beam cut a stark, unforgiving path through the gloom. I dragged the wooden step stool from the pantry, its legs scraping loudly against the pine planks, and positioned it beneath the center of the ceiling. Climbing those 3 steps felt like ascending a mountain. The air near the ceiling was stifling, trapped and stale. I focused the flashlight beam on the frosted glass dome of the fixture. The brass screws holding it in place were tarnished and stubborn. I worked them loose with slow, deliberate turns, the metal biting into the calluses on my thumb and forefinger. I lowered the heavy glass, setting it carefully on the desk beside her ledger, mindful not to disturb the dust. When I looked up into the housing, the reality of the old house bared its teeth. The wiring was ancient, wrapped in brittle, rotting cloth that crumbled at the slightest touch. The insulation had worn away entirely near the base of the fixture, exposing the raw, blackened copper where the spark had jumped. It was a fire hazard, a frayed nerve of the house that had finally snapped under the strain of time. I reached out my fingertips, brushing the cold, stiff wire. It felt like touching bone. There was no simple fix here. Splicing a new end would not hold. The rot went deep into the ceiling, perhaps all the way back to the breaker box on the porch. The walls were plaster and lath, unforgiving and brittle. It required hands that knew the language of current and resistance, hands that could trace the hidden veins of the house without tearing it apart. I stepped down the flashlight beam, swaying wildly across the room, illuminating the spines of her books, the empty chair, the dead bulb. The realization settled over me with a cold certainty. I could fix fences, I could pull calves, I could weather a blizzard, but I could not fix this. I could not bring the light back to her room. The pride of a solitary life is a fragile thing. We convince ourselves we need no one, that the rough walls we build are enough to keep the world at bay. But standing in the dark, breathing in the scent of charred wiring and faded memories, the walls felt like a prison. I needed help. The thought was bitter on my tongue, but the practical reality of the burned wire left no room for stubbornness. I walked to the kitchen, my heavy boots echoing through the quiet house. The rotary phone hung on the wall, a bulky black anchor. I picked up the receiver, the dial tone, a steady, indifferent hum against my ear. I knew of a man in town, an Apache tradesman, who handled the electrical work for the new developments down in the valley. They said he worked quietly, charged fairly, and knew the old wiring of these ranch houses better than the men who built them. Elias. That was his name. I dialed the number, the rhythmic whir of the rotary dial slicing through the silence. I listened to the ringing on the other end, staring out the window at the black outline of the mountains against the night sky. The wind howled again, rattling the glass. When the voice answered deep and resonant, I did not explain the ghost in the room or the weight of the dark. I simply told him the house was old, the wire had burned, and the light was gone. I asked if he could make the drive out. He said he would come tomorrow. I hung up the phone. The house was quiet again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. I walked back down the hall and stood in the doorway of her office one last time. The darkness was total now, impenetrable. But tomorrow, a stranger was coming up the long road, bringing a toolbox and a quiet strength. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt a faint, unfamiliar stirring in my chest. Not hope exactly, but the slow, inevitable turning of a season. The morning sun climbed high and merciless, bleaching the high desert into a canvas of pale gold and cracked clay. I spent the early hours on the south ridge mending a section of barbed wire that a restless steer had trampled in the night. The physical labor was a familiar medicine. The rhythmic strike of the fencing pliers, the sharp bite of the steel wire, the pull of muscles in my shoulders, it grounded me. But underneath the sweat and the routine, the memory of the burned-out room lingered like a shadow, waiting for the sun to drop. Around noon, a distant rumble broke the vast, unbroken silence of the plains. I paused, wiping the grit from my forehead with the back of my heavy leather work glove. Down in the valley, a mile or more out, a thick plume of amber dust was crawling steadily along the switchbacks of the main access road. It was the only road in a deeply rutted track that discouraged casual visitors and kept the world at a safe, deliberate distance. I watched the dust trail for a long time, the tension settling low and tight in my stomach. By the time I rode my gelding back to the main house and washed the worst of the grime from my hands at the outdoor cast-iron pump, the vehicle had cleared the final cattle guard. It was an older pickup truck, the heavy steel body painted a faded matte green that blended seamlessly with the scrub oak and dried sagebrush. The heavy tires crunched over the gravel of the driveway, a loud, intrusive sound in the quiet, empty yard. The truck came to a halt near the edge of the front porch. The engine idled for a moment, a deep, uneven thrum of mechanical power before rattling into absolute silence. For a long minute, nothing happened. The heat haze shimmered relentlessly over the metal hood, and the heavy iron of the engine block ticked as it began to cool in the dry air. Then the driver's side door groaned open on stiff hinges, and a man stepped out onto the sun-baked earth. This was Elias. He was a man carved from the landscape itself, a tall and broad-shouldered, with a stillness about him that commanded immediate respect. He wore heavy canvas work pants, faded almost white at the knees and thighs, and a light blue cotton work shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his forearms. His skin was the color of polished copper, weathered by years of punishing sun and harsh wind, and his dark, heavy hair was pulled back and tied neatly at the nape of his neck. He did not look around with the restless curiosity of a city man. His dark eyes scanned the perimeter of the ranch house, the weathered barn, the empty corrals, and finally settled on me standing by the dripping water pump. His gaze was steady, calm, and entirely unreadable. He reached into the cab of the dusty truck and hauled out a heavy, battered leather tool bag. It looked like it weighed 50 pounds, but he carried it easily in one hand. As he walked toward me, his heavy leather boots kicked up small, rhythmic puffs of dust. There was a deliberate, measured cadence to his stride. He did not rush, and he did not drag his feet. He moved like a man who knew exactly how much energy a task required and spent not a single ounce more. I stepped forward to meet him at the base of the wooden porch steps. "Elias," I said. It was not a question. "That's right," he replied. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone quiet, but carrying effortlessly through the dry, still air. I offered my hand. He shifted the heavy leather bag to his left side and took mine. His grip was firm, his palm heavily calloused from years of pulling raw wire and gripping steel pliers. It was the handshake of a man who worked hard and spoke little. We did not exchange hollow pleasantries about the drive or the weather. The high desert strips away the need for useless words. We both knew why he was standing in my yard. "The wire is in a room down the main hall," I told him, dropping my hand and gesturing toward the shadowed porch. "Old plaster and lath walls, cloth-wrapped wire. It sparked and died last night when I threw the switch." Elias nodded, once a slow understanding tilt of his head. "Old houses," he said softly, looking up at the peeling paint on the eaves. "They hold their breath for a long time before they finally let go." I turned and led the way up the wooden steps. The porch floorboards creaked under our combined weight. I pulled open the heavy oak front door, and we stepped over the threshold, leaving the harsh, blinding glare of the midday sun behind us. The contrast was immediate and physical. The interior of the house was deeply shaded, the air noticeably cooler against the skin. It smelled of saddle soap, old wood ash, and the faint, ever-present scent of pine timber. I walked ahead of him, my boots striking a dull, hollow rhythm on the hardwood floor. I could hear his heavier tread right behind me, steady and perfectly even. As we moved deeper into the house, I felt the familiar, suffocating weight of the silence begin to press in. It was the thick silence of a home that had stopped living 3 years ago. I did not look back to see if Elias felt it too, but I noticed that his footsteps seemed to soften his movements, becoming more deliberate, as if he were navigating a fragile landscape. He did not ask about the framed photographs gathering dust on the mantel or the unused canvas coats hanging motionless on the rack. He simply followed. We reached the end of the long hallway. The heavy oak door to her office stood slightly ajar, just as I had left it in the dark the night before. I stopped, my hand resting heavily on the brass knob. My chest tightened, a sudden fierce reluctance gripping my throat. I had protected this room, preserved it, hidden it away from the world. Opening it to a stranger felt like a violation, a breaking of a sacred unspoken vow to keep her memory undisturbed. I stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching taut and thin between us. Elias did not push. He did not sigh with impatience or shift his weight from foot to foot. He simply stood behind me, a quiet, towering presence in the dim hallway, giving me the time I needed to breathe. Finally, I pushed the heavy door open. The old iron hinges gave a soft, melancholy whine. The gray afternoon light filtered weakly through the dusty window pane, illuminating the roll-top desk, the dried lavender hanging from the exposed rafters and the shattered blackened wires hanging limply from the plaster ceiling. I stepped aside, letting the Apache Electrician cross the threshold into the shadowed room. Elias stepped inside. He set his heavy leather tool bag down on the floorboards with a soft, muted thud. He looked at the desk, at the stacked books, and finally up at the broken, charred fixture. He did not say a word, but as he reached up to unbutton his shirt cuffs, I saw the profound, quiet respect in his dark eyes. He understood exactly what kind of room he was standing in. Elias moved with a deliberate economy of motion that made the small, crowded office feel somehow immense. He did not ask me to move her things. He did not suggest clearing the roll-top desk to make room for his broad shoulders or his heavy leather bag. Instead, he found a patch of bare floorboard near the iron radiator, setting his tools down with a muted thud that barely disturbed the thick layer of dust coating the hardwood. I stayed leaning against the door jamb, half in the hallway, half in the room. My arms were crossed tightly over my chest, my hands tucked under my biceps, a defensive, closed-off posture I hadn't realized I was holding. The air in the room was still dead heavy, with the sharp metallic memory of the blown circuit and the lingering ghost of dried yarrow. Elias knelt beside his bag, unbuckling the thick leather straps. The sharp, clean scent of oiled steel-worn canvas and leather dressing drifted upward, cutting through the stagnant, suffocating atmosphere. He drew out a heavy industrial flashlight, its steel casing battered and scarred from years of hard use, alongside a pair of long-handled wire snips and a roll of black friction tape. He stood his joints silent and approached the center of the room. He dragged the wooden step stool closer, testing its weight and stability with one heavy, dirt-scuffed boot before stepping up. When he reached the ceiling, his broad shoulders practically brushed the exposed, rough-hewn wooden joists. He clicked on the heavy flashlight. The stark, brilliant white beam cut through the afternoon gloom like a physical blade, illuminating the blackened, brittle mess of the old cloth-wrapped wiring hanging from the plaster recess. From my spot in the doorway, I watched his hands. They were large, capable hands, the knuckles thick and white-scarred, the skin dusted with the pale gray of old drywall and plaster. Yet when he reached up to touch the burnt, shattered housing, his fingers moved with a startling, unexpected gentleness. It was as if he were examining a wounded animal soothing a skittish horse, rather than diagnosing a dead circuit. He traced the path of the ruined copper, his thumb sliding over the charred, crumbling insulation. The faint, dry sound of the rotting cloth flaking away under his calluses filled the quiet room loud as a struck match. "The rot goes deep," he murmured. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate directly in my own chest, bypassing the air entirely. It wasn't a complaint, merely a quiet statement of fact delivered to the house itself. "Past the junction box. The copper up here has gone brittle as dry bone." I nodded, though the angle of the harsh light meant he likely couldn't see me in the shadows. "Can it be saved?" I asked, my voice sounding uncharacteristically thin and rough from days of disuse. Elias didn't answer immediately. He reached down to his heavy leather tool belt, drawing a utility knife. The steel blade snapped out with a sharp, definitive click that echoed off the bare plaster walls. "I'll have to pull new line from the hallway chase," he said, his gaze fixed upward. "Splice it back where the wire is still green and breathing, where it still has some fight left in it." He went to work. I did not move from the doorframe. The rhythm of his labor quickly became a hypnotic, steadying cadence in the shadowed room. The sharp, decisive snip of the heavy steel cutters biting cleanly through thick-gauge copper. The repetitive scrape of the blade stripping away stubborn, decades-old insulation. The subtle, rhythmic creak of the wooden stool under his shifting weight. I watched the play of muscle beneath his faded cotton shirt, the steady expansion and contraction of his broad back as he worked with his arms raised above his head. He worked for over an hour without pausing to ask for a glass of water, without wiping his brow, without once complaining about the stifling, trapped heat that always gathered near the ceiling. More importantly, he treated the room not as a dusty construction site, but as a sanctuary. At one point, his pliers slipped, and a small chunk of brittle white plaster fell from the ceiling, landing precisely beside the dry inkwell on her roll-top desk. Elias stopped instantly. He lowered his tools. He wiped his calloused, chalky hand carefully on his heavy canvas thigh, ensuring it was clean. Then he reached down and gently, meticulously brushed the white dust away from the dark, polished wood, catching the debris in his other palm so it wouldn't soil the floor. He did it naturally, without looking back to see if I was watching, without seeking approval or offering an apology. It was a simple, practical act of profound respect that spoke infinitely louder than any hollow words of sympathy a neighbor might have offered. The tight defensive knot in my shoulders began very slowly to unspool. My arms dropped to my sides. The harsh, bitter smell of the burnt ozone was slowly being overwhelmed by the scent of the man himself. The honest smell of clean sweat, sun-baked cotton, and the sharp metallic tang of newly stripped copper wire. I watched him twist the shining raw ends of the new line together, binding them with slow, powerful practice turns of his thick wrists. We were two solitary men standing in a dead woman's room, surrounded by the wreckage of time and failed infrastructure, yet the heavy silence between us was no longer a suffocating void. It was becoming a bridge built of copper-quiet labor and bone-deep understanding. The air in the house had grown dense and stagnant by late afternoon, pressing against the window panes like a physical weight. The heat of the high desert usually broke as the sun lowered, but today it lingered thick and unyielding. Inside the shadowed office, Elias worked with the same steady, unbroken rhythm, his hands moving among the exposed wires with quiet authority. But I could see the damp patches of sweat blooming across the shoulders of his faded blue work shirt, the slow, deliberate rise and fall of his broad chest. Through the smudged glass, the sky began to change. The bruised purple of the horizon darkened into a violent, churning charcoal. A sudden, sharp drop in the barometric pressure made my ears pop, and the wind, previously a dry whisper, suddenly slammed against the side of the house with a heavy, howling force. It carried the unmistakable metallic scent of ozone-bruised sagebrush and wet dust. A squall was rolling off the foothills, moving fast across the open plains. Elias lowered his heavy wire snips and let out a long, slow breath. He rolled his shoulders, the joints popping softly in the quiet room. He looked toward the window, watching the dark clouds swallow the remaining daylight. "The storm is breaking," he said, his voice a low rumble that harmonized perfectly with the distant thunder. "It is I," it replied. I pushed off the doorframe, my boots sounding loud and decisive against the hardwood. "Leave it for a spell. The wire isn't going anywhere. I am putting a pot of coffee on." Elias nodded once. He set his tools down with his usual meticulous care, laying the snips parallel to the heavy flashlight, and followed me down the dim hallway toward the kitchen. The kitchen was the heart of the house, though it had felt hollow and cold for years. I went to the cast iron stove, striking a long wooden match against the brick surround. The sulfur flared bright and sharp before catching the edges of the dry kindling inside the firebox. I filled the battered blue enamel percolator from the iron pump sink, measuring out the coarse, dark grounds by sight and feel. Elias stood near the doorway, giving me space. He did not hover, but his presence filled the room solid and undeniably grounding. I gestured toward the enameled basin. He stepped forward, rolling his sleeves up another notch, and turned the brass faucet. I watched from the corner of my eye as he scrubbed the white plaster dust and black oxidation from his hands, the water turning a milky gray before spiraling down the drain. He dried his hands on a rough cotton towel, his movements slow and entirely methodical. The coffee began to percolate, a rhythmic popping boil that filled the kitchen with the rich, dark aroma of roasted beans. It was a smell that belonged to early mornings and shared lives, a smell that had been absent from this house for far too long. I pulled 2 heavy ceramic mugs from the open pine shelving mugs, thick enough to keep the heat from burning your palms, and poured the pitch-black liquid. I handed one to Elias. Our fingers brushed briefly against the warm ceramic. His skin was rough, calloused, but entirely steady. "Black," I said. It was not a question, just a fact I somehow instinctively knew. "Always," he replied, wrapping both large hands around the mug. We walked out the back door and onto the covered wooden porch, just as the sky ripped open. The rain did not start with a gentle drizzle. It fell in a sudden violent sheet, heavy and freezing cold. The first drops hit the parched, dusty earth of the yard with loud percussive smacks, kicking up tiny craters of dry dirt before the ground finally surrendered and turned to dark, slick mud. The sound of the rain hitting the corrugated tin roof was deafening, a roaring metallic waterfall that instantly washed out the oppressive silence of the ranch. We stood side by side, leaning against the rough timber railing, shielded from the downpour by the wide overhang. The air temperature plummeted in an instant, the sudden biting chill raising goosebumps on my forearms. I brought the hot mug to my lips, letting the bitter, scalding coffee bite back the cold. Elias did the same. We did not look at each other. We looked out at the churning gray curtain of rain, watching it obscure the barn, the empty corrals, the distant ridge. The world shrank down to the perimeter of the wooden porch, isolating us in a small, dry sanctuary amid the deluge. There is a specific kind of intimacy that only happens in silence, when 2 people are faced with the raw, overwhelming force of the land. We stood shoulder to shoulder, close enough that I could feel the radiant heat coming off his damp cotton shirt, close enough to smell the faint trace of wood smoke clinging to his clothes and the sharp tang of copper still lingering on his fingers. He did not offer empty platitudes about the weather, and he did not try to fill the roaring space with useless small talk. He just stood with me. For a man who had spent 3 years carrying the crushing weight of an empty house all by himself, the simple act of standing next to someone who was strong enough to share the silence was entirely undoing. The storm raged on, thrashing the ancient cottonwood trees and turning the dry creek bed into a rushing, muddy torrent. I watched the water wash over the cracked earth, soaking deep into the roots of the dead prairie grass. The smell of wet creosote filled the air, a sharp medicinal perfume that signaled survival in the desert. Something hard and calcified inside my chest began to ache, a slow, agonizing thaw. I took another drink of the bitter coffee, letting the heat settle deep in my stomach. Elias shifted his weight, his heavy leather boots scraping against the wet, slippery floorboards, and very subtly the side of his arm pressed against mine. It was a fleeting contact, barely there, but in the freezing damp of the storm, it was a brand of pure heat. He did not pull away, and neither did I. We stayed like that, anchored together on the edge of the porch, drinking black coffee, and watching the desert drink its fill, letting the violent, beautiful rain wash the dust of the past 3 years away. The sudden squall broke and scattered just as the sun dipped behind the jagged spine of the western ridge. It left behind a hushed, dripping world heavy with the raw scent of wet earth and bruised creosote. The violent drumming on the corrugated tin roof slowed to a rhythmic, steady pulse of water falling from the wooden eaves, pooling in the muddy yard. The sky bruised into a deep, vibrant violet, the last remnants of daylight bleeding out over the high desert. The drop in temperature was absolute, a sharp winter-edged chill that sank deep into the timber of the old house, promising a bitter night ahead. We left the empty ceramic mugs on the kitchen counter and walked back down the long hallway. The house felt entirely different now. The suffocating static heat of the afternoon had been chased out by the storm. In its place was a cool, heavy stillness. It no longer felt like a closed tomb. It felt like a structure holding its breath, waiting for a verdict. Elias stepped back into the office. The ambient light from the smudged window pane was failing, fast turning the corners of the room into deep, impenetrable pools of charcoal shadow. He did not switch on his heavy, battered flashlight. He did not seem to need it. Instead, he moved by instinct and a quiet, practiced memory, his large frame a dark, solid silhouette against the graying glass. He found his heavy leather tool bag on the floorboards, the thick brass buckles clinking softly as he retrieved a dense roll of black friction tape. I stood in the doorway, my shoulder pressed against the familiar jamb. Normally, this was the hour I dreaded most. The transition from dusk to true night was always a brutal reminder of the house's emptiness, a time when the shadows stretched long and the quiet became a physical pressure against my eardrums. But tonight, the air in the room no longer smelled of ozone, scorched dust, and stagnant grief. It smelled of the damp wind pushing through the loose window casing, of old dried paper, and of the clean, sharp sweat of the man working steadily in the center of the floor. Elias climbed the wooden step stool, his heavy boots perfectly silent on the treads. I watched the outline of his broad back as he reached up into the dark plaster cavity of the ceiling. The sharp tearing sound of the friction tape unspooling cut through the quiet room. It was a decisive binding sound, loud in the stillness. He worked with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, wrapping the spliced copper lines tight, sealing the raw metal away, making the broken, dangerous circuit whole again. I could hear the subtle, controlled shift of his breathing, the soft rustle of his stiff canvas work pants, the quiet, abrasive scrape of his calloused thumbs, smoothing the heavy tape over the old wire. He was meticulously burying the damage, ensuring the current would flow safely, contained and guided. There was a profound comfort in listening to a man who knew exactly how to mend what was broken. The darkness deepened, rapidly thickening around us, until the roll-top desk, the stacked ledgers and the hanging bundles of dried yarrow were completely swallowed by the night. The window became a square of pitch black. The only thing left in the room was the sound of his steady labor and the radiant, unseen heat of his body moving in the freezing air. "The line is secure." His voice was a low, resonant vibration in the absolute dark. It startled me not because it was loud, but because it felt impossibly intimate in the pitch black. He stepped down from the wooden stool. I heard the floorboards creak in a slow, rhythmic progression as he shifted his weight. He did not walk toward his tool bag to pack up. He walked toward the door, toward me. I held my breath, my back going rigid against the wooden frame. I could not see him, but I could feel his approach. The sheer physical gravity of the man displaced the cold air in the small room. He stopped less than a foot away. The scent of rain wood smoke and warm cotton was suddenly overwhelming, wrapping around me like a heavy wool blanket. I could hear the slow, measured intake of his breath, unhurried and calm. I reached out my hand toward the wall, blindly seeking the brass toggle switch. My fingers were stiff with the cold, trembling slightly with a sudden, unnameable anticipation. The memory of the blinding blue spark and the acrid smoke from the night before flared in my mind, making me hesitate. My hand hovered an inch from the plaster wall, suspended in the dark, caught between the desire for light and the ingrained fear of another failure. Then I felt it. His hand moved through the blackness and found mine. His palm was rough-mapped with deep calluses and thick scars born of hard labor, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He did not grab my wrist or force my movement. He simply laid his large, heavy hand over the back of my knuckles. The heat of his skin sank straight through me, an anchoring, undeniable warmth in the freezing chill of the hallway. It was a protective, steadying weight. It stopped my slight tremor instantly. We stood frozen in the dark, the silence stretching out thick and vibrating with 100 unspoken words. For 3 long years, I had navigated the dark entirely alone, bracing myself against the walls, expecting every wire to burn, every foundation to finally crack under the strain. But standing there with the heavy calloused hand of the Apache tradesman covering mine, the rigid defensive walls I had built around my chest quietly, inevitably surrendered. He leaned in his subtle movement, shifting the cold air against my cheek. When he spoke, His voice was a raw, textured whisper, meant only for the two of us and the silent ghosts inhabiting the room. "You don't have to carry the dark by yourself," he breathed. The words were simple, fiercely practical, and completely devoid of pity. They were a statement of fact from a man who intimately knew the crushing weight of a heavy load. He slowly slid his hand down his rough fingers, tracing the side of my palm until his fingertips came to rest lightly over mine, pressing them gently against the cold brass plate of the switch. "It will hold," Elias whispered against the dark. "Throw the switch." Under the steady grounding weight of his hand, I pressed the cold brass toggle upward. The ancient mechanism engaged with a sharp, definitive click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I braced myself entirely on instinct, my shoulders tensing for the blinding flash of blue arc, my lungs tight against the expected acrid bite of burning copper. But the darkness did not bite back. Instead, a low, steady hum vibrated through the plaster, a sound so faint you had to feel it in your teeth rather than hear it. Then the frosted glass dome overhead bloomed with a sudden rich golden light. It spilled out across the rough-hewn ceiling joists in a warm cascade, chased the heavy, suffocating charcoal shadows from the deep corners, and washed down over the scarred oak of the roll-top desk. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my chest rising and falling in a ragged, uneven breath. The room did not look like a frozen, dust-choked tomb anymore. Bathed in that steady, even unblinking glow, the space was entirely transformed. The hanging bundles of dried lavender and yarrow no longer looked like spectral remnants. They looked purposeful, holding the rich colors of a late summer harvest. The stacked leather ledgers seemed merely to be waiting patiently for a fountain pen. The oppressive, breathless weight of the past 3 years, the physical manifestation of my solitary grief, evaporated into the illuminated air. It was replaced by the clean, sharp, unforgiving scent of the cold rain slipping through the loose window sash. Elias slowly withdrew his hand. The sudden absence of his rough, calloused warmth left a sharp phantom ache across my knuckles, a stark and immediate contrast to the freezing draft bleeding into the hallway. I kept my hand suspended near the switch for a long moment, reluctant to let the physical memory of his touch fade. He stepped back into the center of the illuminated room, his heavy work boots sounding solid and permanent against the pine floorboards. He did not look at me with pity, nor did he search my face for any grand, weeping display of gratitude. His dark, impenetrable eyes simply swept the perimeter of the ceiling, checking his handiwork, watching the steady, unbroken flow of current. Satisfied that the wire would hold, he knelt beside his battered leather bag on the dusty floor. I leaned against the doorframe, watching the fluid play of heavy muscle in his broad shoulders beneath the damp, faded cotton of his shirt. He meticulously returned his heavy steel wire snips, the dense roll of black friction tape, and his scarred metal flashlight to their precise designated places. Every movement was an exercise in deliberate, unhurried care. It was a quiet testament to a man who valued order, who respected his tools, and who understood the profound dignity of honest, silent labor. He pulled the thick leather straps tight, the heavy brass hardware clinking softly, a comforting metallic rhythm in the newly warmed room. He lifted the heavy bag effortlessly with one massive hand and walked toward the door. I stepped back, giving his broad frame a wide berth, though a strange, undeniable new gravity seemed to pull at the narrow space between us. We walked back down the long, dim hallway, together, our boots keeping a slow, synchronized time. The house felt vast and resonant around us, no longer shrinking inward in defense against the dark. Out on the covered front porch, the winter night had fully and ruthlessly settled. The violent storm had passed entirely, leaving behind a black, fathomless sky shattered from edge to edge with hard, glittering, ice-white stars. The air was brutally cold, stinging the inside of my nose, smelling deeply of wet sagebrush, freezing mud, and crushed pine needles. Elias walked down the wooden steps and set his heavy tools into the bed of his faded green truck, the metal tailgate groaning in protest under his shifting weight. I stood on the top step, pulling the collar of my canvas jacket up against the biting wind, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, my right hand still holding fiercely onto the lingering ghost of his calloused touch. His breath plumed in the freezing air, thick white clouds of heat dissipating into the dark. "What do I owe you for the labor, Elias?" I asked. My voice was steady, carrying a low, resonant strength in the crisp night air that it had lacked for years. He turned around, leaning one heavy hip against the cold steel fender of the truck. He looked out over the darkened, rolling expanse of the high desert, watching the wind whip across the invisible sage, before finally bringing his dark gaze back up to the porch. "The ceiling wire is sound," he said, his deep baritone cutting effortlessly through the bitter winter bite. "It will burn bright for another 50 years. But that main breaker panel on the back wall of the porch is showing its age. The iron casing is rusted completely through at the bottom. The elements are getting inside. It will not survive the heavy spring thaws." He paused, the silence stretching out between us, thick with 100 unspoken things. His dark eyes caught the faint distant starlight. "I will need to come back," he stated softly. "Bring some heavier gauge copper. Pull a new line from the pole. Maybe Tuesday." It was not a question. It was not a business proposition. It was a vital, heavy lifeline thrown with the rough, practical grace of a stoic man who dealt strictly in copper steel and actions rather than words. "Tuesday," I repeated. The single word tasted like a profound, terrifying promise on my tongue. "I'll make sure the coffee is hot." He nodded once, a slow, definitive tilt of his head. He pulled open the heavy steel door of his truck and climbed inside. The ancient engine roared to life, a deep mechanical heartbeat that echoed off the jagged spine of the ridge. I stood frozen on the steps and watched the twin red taillights bounce down the deeply rutted driveway, carving a brilliant path through the absolute dark, until they finally disappeared, entirely beyond the distant cattle guard. I turned back to the quiet house. The golden light from her office window spilled out across the wet, freezing earth of the yard, casting a perfect, unyielding square of defiant warmth against the brutal night. It is a profoundly strange and terrifying thing to finally let your defenses fall to allow a quiet, capable stranger to wire a completely new path through your longest dark. Sometimes survival on the frontier isn't about bracing for the bitter storm all by yourself. It is about having the raw, quiet courage to let someone stand shoulder to shoulder with you and help fix the broken foundation. I stood alone on the porch listening to the high desert wind singing through the wire and wondering if you have ever found yourself standing in the shadowed ruins of a quiet life, waiting for someone to simply show up and help carry the heaviest things. If you understand the deep, unspoken language of a repaired light and a shared cup of black coffee, tell me about the steady hands that helped you rebuild your own foundation down in the comments below.